Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center. I am Sherry Goodman. I'm a senior fellow here now with the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Polar Initiative, and the Global Women's Leadership. I'm very pleased that you're all here today. The Woodrow Wilson Center has just been named the #1 regional think tank and very high in many other categories, so we're very proud of the Wilson Center. And we reach across, in this area of the Environmental Change and Security Program, we reach across all regional domains. So we're very excited about that. But I want to also recognize Lauren Herzer-Risey, who is our acting director of the Environmental Change and Security Program, and a lot of great people who helped put this event together today, Ben and some of our other great team. But I have multiple hats, as you probably know. And one of my hats is I'm also the founder of the CNA Military Advisory Board. I'm very pleased to welcome the Military Advisory Board here today and my successor, Sherry Rosenblum, who is the executive director of the Military Advisory Board. And we're very excited to launch the MAB's most recent report on water stress with you all here today. So welcome, friends. And we'll get the program started with Sherry.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I'm Sherry Rosenblum. As Sherry said, I'm the Executive Director of the Military Advisory Board. There was no name change when we moved it over. It was easy. I'm very excited to be here for this discussion on the role of water stress across the spectrum of conflict. And I just wanted to take a minute and just thank the Wilson Center, and in particular, Lauren and Sherry for hosting us today. For those of you who are not familiar with CNA, we are a 600-person research and analysis institute located in Arlington. Our focus for the last 75 years has been primarily on national security and homeland security, so we tend to look at the world through that kind of a lens. Over the last few decades, one of the things that we've really seen has been the rise of some emerging and non-traditional threats. Threats like cyber, AI, violent extremism, and environmental stressors like energy security, water security, climate security. And when Sherry was at CNA and set up the CNA Military Advisory Board, it was a new model for us. She brought together 11 3- and 4-star admirals and generals to take a look at climate change as a national security stressor. And that was really the beginning of a body of work kind of connecting natural resource scarcity, climate, water, food, and again, national and global security. Since that first report, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, the Military Advisory Board has put out 8 reports, again, looking at these connections between natural resources and national security. And this new report, which is again on water and conflict, water across the spectrum of conflict, really kind of came out of this body of work. The genesis of it, though, came from really CNA's kind of core national security work. Julia McQuaid, who's here today, who's the primary author on the report. Julia is a Middle East and violent extremism analyst. She runs our transnational threats program. And she came in my office one day because she said, I'm doing all this work on Boko Haram and Lake Chad keeps coming up over and over and over again. And that was really the beginning of a conversation about water stress and how water stress can be a factor in conflict. So today's discussion really looks at this issue. It brings together a panel of national security and diplomacy experts to examine water stress in the context of global trends. And I want to talk about global trends for one more second because we have Susie Fry here. One of the kind of main pieces of research that was really used as part of this was the global trends work that comes out of the National Intelligence Council. We saw a lot of connection between our work on water and the global trends report. So we have Susie here to also be talking a little bit about that. So I'd like to also just quickly thank our panelists for joining us. We have both of the vice chairmen of the CNA Military Advisory Board, Admiral Gunn and General Galloway. We have the Honorable Sarah Sewell. We have Suzanne Fry from the National Intelligence Council. And again, Julia McQuaid, the lead author on our new report. And lastly, I'd just like to thank Sherry again for hosting us and also for moderating today. So thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. Before we get started, I have one more thank you to add here, and that is to Leo Gough. Leo Gough has been managing the CNA Military Advisory Board ably for a number of years now. He and I were partners doing this together starting back, I don't know, it's about 8 years ago. And Leo is the best cruise director we've ever had. And all of the MAB members are always happy to sail on his ship, right, Lee?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep.
good. So thank you, Leo, for all that you've done for the MAB and for CNA and for many of us over many years. Okay, we have a great group, so we're going to get started. I'm going to briefly introduce each one, and then we're going to kind of do this as a conversation, and then we're going to open it up for questions at about 10:30. Okay, good. So first, Susan, I'm going to just introduce everybody, and then I'm going to ask some questions and have a dialogue. Susie Fry is at the National Intelligence Council, the director of the Strategic Futures Group, and known most of us as sort of the leader of the Global Trends Report. And many of you know that and follow it or are a part of it, but for those of you who don't, this is sort of the seminal document that lays a foundation for global trends across the U.S. government. It's been really in DOD we might say foreshaping, but it's bigger than that. It's sort of global trends shaping, and it's done in a very engaged way, engaging communities and strategic thinkers across the globe. And it really helps shape not only how we think in the United States, but with our partners and our allies. And I want to thank Susie and her team for the work that she's done and the tradition she has carried on of this important work. General Galloway, next up, has been the vice chairman of the MAB now for some time, but he's also had a very distinguished career in the United States Army, in the Army Corps of Engineers. When I first met him, when I was in DOD over 20 years ago now, he was already a general officer working on tasking from the White House to solve some of the most challenging water issues we faced during that era, from floods along the Mississippi to many other global water issues. And as the first chairman of our Military Advisory Board, General Gordon Sullivan said, and everything water is General Galloway. He's a national treasure. So thank you, Jerry, for your continued service. Admiral Lee Gunn, I've had the pleasure of working with for many years now. He's served with distinction in the Navy, in the United States Navy, for over 30 years, and he served with distinction at CNA, where I first got to know him, leading one of our two major divisions there, the Institute for Public Research, and also has been associated with the Military Advisory Board now for almost a decade, and has become one of its most astute spokesmen, really understanding the connections between water stress, climate change, energy security, and national security, and being able to communicate it to a broad range of audiences. And so thank you, Lee, very much for your dedicated service. Julia, as Sherry said, has been the lead author on this report, and that's seminal. And I got to meet Julia first when you were doing your Middle East analysis at CNA and working sort of deep in the trenches on a lot of core operational issues, analytic issues for the military. And I think it's really speaks well of the evolution of this field of environmental security research, that we now have really premier analysts like Julia who are leading this type of work in this area. And so, because I think the future of this field is really the fusion of national security professionals with environmental security professionals, and that brings a whole new lens through which to do this work. So thank you, Julia. And Sarah Sewell, who has been my dear friend for, we won't count the years now, but we've been through many trenches together, from the Hill to the Department of Defense, and Sarah served with distinction not only on the Board of Trustees of CNA, but also then as the Undersecretary of State for, I want to make sure I get the title actually right here. Where is the title, Sarah?
It's civilian security democracy.
There we go. Civilian, okay. Okay, everything sort of important in sort of connecting foreign policy into civilian security and human rights and it was a broad portfolio where she worked many issues, of which water stress we're going to talk about today, I think, was underlying many of those. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your work across many years, and now you serve at Johns Hopkins and still with counterterrorism, refugees, fighting international crime, promoting human rights, and preventing conflict. Just a few small things to worry about at night. Okay. Let's get started with this report. And I'm going to start with you, Lee. In broad terms, explain to us how water stress connects with population growth, the rising middle class, and climate change, and how are these emerging stressors connected to national security?
Wow, that's a really a great mouthful of questions.
3 minutes.
3 minutes,
Yeah,
okay.
More.
We
5.
we have been concerned from the beginning on the Military Advisory Board with not only the state of things today, but the conditions that our national security forces will need to face in the future and the demands that will be placed on them. And we believe that there are a collection of stressors, water among them, which will make life more difficult in the United States, but certainly around the world. And that in many of the circumstances that arise from those difficulties, the U.S. military, the national security apparatus of the United States will have to be involved. Population will continue to grow, and of course, the demand for water will not be, as is the case with energy, the demand for water will not be linear. As the numbers increase and the aspirations for an improved quality of life are met, we hope, then the demand for water will increase as well. And so the stresses that we already see around the world, the arguments over basin rights for water, the depletion of water in major cities around the world, we think will aggravate the problems that already are beginning to manifest themselves. Think of Cape Town right now on day 0, which is something like the 12th of April when the taps will be turned off. This is not necessarily due to mismanagement, although mismanagement is a feature of the use of water around the world today. And it's our hope that by taking steps to head off failed states, failing states, weak states that presently are not doing their part in providing this essential service to their populations, that we will be able to head off at the same time some military conflicts. But the rising middle class, the changing climate, the existing maldistribution of water is going to be aggravated. There'll be more water where there's already potentially too much. There'll be less water where there's already not enough. And both of those circumstances will cause, among other things, the potential for migration, mass migrations, which we're already demonstrating around the world that we're having difficulty contending with. So I think those connections between climate, the rising middle class, the growth of the population, doubling potentially in Africa where there are already many water stresses, adding 400 million perhaps in South Asia, and then the attendant rise to the middle class. We're not far from the point where the Chinese middle class will be larger than the population of the United States. And so this is barreling at us, and we need to deal with it.
Okay, Lee, why do military leaders, why are they interested in water stress issues?
Well, from the beginning, as you know, we have talked about the consequences of climate change and the energy issues surrounding reliable delivery of energy and meeting aspirations for that have contributed to existing difficulties around the world that result often in humanitarian assistance and disaster response for the U.S. military. Let me just quote something that I wrote down here from the beginning of our report. You know, if all else fails, go back to your report. We say at the beginning, as senior military officers, we see water stress, the lack of adequate fresh water, as a growing factor in the world's hotspots and conflict areas, many of vital interest to the United States. This is a theme that you'll find from the very first report that we issued on climate change, where we talked about the climate change consequences being a threat multiplier. And we talked later in an update of that report about the accelerating risks of climate change. We talked about that we were seeing already catalysts for conflict that were definitely traceable to the consequences of climate change. And so water being one of those predominant consequences, it seems to us, is a factor that we just have to deal with. And many now who are interested in the water area say that we'll be thirsty before we're hot. That's a nice catchy phrase, but I think it portrays the urgency with which we have to contend with these issues.
Thank you. Julia, maybe you could help us unpack this a little bit more as the principal author and analyst of this report. Explain to us the connections between water and conflict across the spectrum of conflict as you've looked at it.
Sure. Thank you. So before I kind of jump into that link, I'll just take a step back and say, you know, coming from this as a conflict researcher, there were a couple of kind of things that we put forward in our analysis before we jumped in, and I'll mention two. The first is that we know that there are different types of conflict. So some people just like to think conflict or no conflict, but conflict actually exists on a spectrum. So we adopted that spectrum for our analysis, and it goes from the very low end, which is unrest, civil discord, and low-end political instability. Then we look at localized conflicts between different communities, municipalities, tribal groups, and then we step up to kind of insurgencies, civil wars, and this is the type of warfare that is actually predominant in the world today and has been for the past couple of decades. And these fights and wars often involve terrorist organizations, so we can fold the VEO piece into this, violent extremist organizations. And then finally, we look at the high end, so state-on-state wars. And what we were really trying to do is trying to understand water stress across that spectrum. And another thing I'll just put forward is, you know, wars and conflict and unrest usually or almost always aren't caused by a single thing. So we like to look at it as water stress as a factor. You don't need to understand it as the cause for it to have value. And so what we put forth is how do we understand it as a factor or its role within conflict. So, you know, I'll just put that forth, and let me just give you a few examples across the spectrum that kind of reinforce what Admiral Gunn already said and tie together some of these themes. So, for example, if you look at the low end, and Cape Town is potentially a good example of this, people are more frequently referring to Iran as, you know, when large populations don't have enough water, which we call water stress in the report, which means that there's not enough to meet demand either because of access, quantity, or quality. So we define that broadly, and part of that is just that the national security community can easily access the concepts. But when you see that in certain parts of the world, and this is pretty consistent, populations that don't have access to enough water, it will often, in certain environments, trigger unrest, whether those are riots, protests, strikes, and in a lot of cases, those will fizzle out. There'll either be a Band-Aid approach to fixing it, but in some rare cases, it can escalate. And we find that when it does escalate, it's often because there are other pre-existing grievances within those communities. And our other takeaway from that kind of area and connection is that this often happens in urban settings, urban areas. And as we think about the growth of mega cities, 29 today, how many will there be in the future with aging infrastructure and things like this, you know, something to watch. So a second example that I'll just give, which I think we can probably dive into later on, is, and there's a lot of interest in kind of violent extremist organizations and the role of water stress in the types of conflicts where we see these groups operating today. So, you know, we're thinking of Syria, we're thinking of Yemen, we're thinking of Libya. And, you know, kind of there is a real push to find the connection between water stress and VEOs. And really what we found is that, you know, in the world of conflict analyses and studies, having looked at these types of organizations for a long time, we know that one thing they are very good at doing is exploiting local conditions, be they political, economic, social, to their advantage. And so we weren't surprised to find that when you have the conditions of water stress present, it creates the types of vulnerabilities that these organizations can then exploit to their advantage. So one thing that they can do, for example, is populations, and Lake Chad Basin, I think, is a good example of this, where the shrinking lake, which is 90% of its original size, has driven large populations of people who formerly made their living from the river, whether it's fishing, whether it's other livelihoods that they earn from that river, being driven physically from their homes and their livelihood, and not really having a ton of other options, and so making those types of individuals more vulnerable to Boko Haram recruitment. And we see this in other parts of the world, but that is one example that comes up over and over again. I'll just put forward one more kind of large takeaway, which is there's a lot of work that's been done previously on shared river basins. So think of the Nile, the Mekong, the Indus River, and people, speculating that these countries will go to war over their shared water. So historically, we have shown, or it has been shown, that this doesn't happen. And, folks like General Galloway like to say water is not for fighting, it's for cooperation. And there's a lot of people who have been doing work in this area for decades, and that's kind of the mantra, because it brings these partners to the table in ways that they may otherwise not come to talk. And that's, true of India and Pakistan in particular. But, a lot of those kinds of conclusions are based on the fact that there are in place, and there's over 200 of them, various mechanisms to resolve conflicts over shared water boundaries, whether they be formal treaties, agreements, commissions, and there's a range of different types. And they've been robust in helping these states work through their water issues. And we don't see that changing a whole lot, except I'll put forward two things. One is that if water stress continues to get worse in places where it already exists and spreads into new areas, the stakes potentially become higher, right? And so we have to make sure that we don't just rest on our laurels, that just because these efforts have worked in the past, that they'll continue to work into the future, and there will never be, some type of conflict over shared water resources. The other piece I'll say is that as we think about the new national defense strategy, and our competitors in the world and the U.S. competitors, and do these emerging kind of water conflicts present apertures or vulnerabilities that others could potentially move into and take advantage of? So just trying to make this link to the DoD a little bit more, kind of now that there's a new defense strategy, there is room to think about this a little bit more within that context. So I'll just stop there, and hopefully we can jump more into it.
Great. Okay. Terrific. That's great, Julia. Could you, Jerry, explain to us how, in your decades of work in this area, what's the trend that you see? Because you've kind of been in this water stress space kind of way before many others were, and we're talking about it. And why is it getting worse, and how does it fit more broadly into kind of overall water security management as you conceive it?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I wish I had the answer. In reality, we have been worrying about water stress for a long time. And one of the problems is I think we tend to focus on WASH, which is so important. We've got millions of people around the world who are suffering as a result of not having access to water. But on the other hand, we have something called integrated water resource management that says it's really wonderful to make the sanitation improve by building a wonderful treatment plant and then have it be washed away by the next flood. You have to be able to take all of the things that affect water and take them as a whole. You mentioned the Mekong. What is the issue in the Mekong? They're not hungering for water as much as they're hungering for hydroelectric power to get money to be able to live in a better way. So we have to always keep these things together. I was taken, I'm a water policy management wonk, for lack of anything else, and I recognize our stress is due to too little, too dirty, too much water, and all of those things have to be looked at together. OECD came up with a quote about 5 years ago that said there's enough water on Earth for all, even in areas where temporary shortages may exist. Managing water for all is not only a question of resource availability and money, but equally a matter of good governance. Water is essentially a local issue and involves a plethora of stakeholders at basin, municipal, regional, national, and international levels. It is really complex. And as Julia has pointed out, it gets everybody into the game, and it can start at the local level. The grievances start at the local level. I'll give you the one example that really has spurred me. Cochabamba in Bolivia, a few years back, they had the issue of how do we get water? And the answer was, let's bring in the people that really know. We'll hire some companies to do this. And they said, we want you to build a new dam, we want you to build new infrastructure, and then charge the rates that you need to charge in order to make it work. Well, Bechtel and another company came in and they abided by the contract and started charging the rates that it cost to produce that water. Nobody had thought about what that might be, and they had riots, just the kind that would start a civil unrest in the country. Well, they figured that out. They shut down the contract and went off in the way it had been before and subsidized heavily the water system. It dampened down. People did not understand. The management didn't understand what was going to happen and relate it to the social structure of that particular country. When we have water that's too dirty, what is that a result of? It's a result of human actions, where we don't have any sort of sewage systems, industrial, agricultural, where we don't care. Is that unusual? I mean, is it just in the third world? No. We're still trying to clean up the Mississippi River and from agricultural products which come from the Midwest. Where are we in that? It's a struggle between the value system of one group in the country and another group in the country, and who has the most power. And so as OECD looks at it, you have to have people that are willing to lay out what these challenges are and put them in front of people to say, we've got to make some decisions. Too little water, allocation of water. Who does the allocation of water? Big issue all around the world. Do you allocate it for hydropower? Do you allocate it for navigation? The Chinese struggle with this on a daily basis, as do the people in the Mekong Basin, which includes, again, the Chinese. What are we going to do about that? Who makes those sorts of decisions? The challenges we face in looking at management, you peel back the onion, you'd see such things as inequalities in the way the water is allocated, used, distributed in a particular country. The inequalities between those who are rich and at the beginning of the irrigation pipeline, and when it gets to the end, those who get what's left over. It's recognized it's a challenge, but people don't tend to address that sort of thing because what's influencing it? The social, cultural, religious structure of the country. They've always been at the end of the line. Until we start addressing some issues like that, we have a problem. The World Water Assessment Program in 2009 came up with something called the water box. At the top of the box were the public at large, the influencers, which are the big companies, and the politicians. And then below them was another box filled with water professionals, all who thought they knew and probably did know most of what they needed to know to run an efficient system. But the two were not connected. And we actually did a survey at the World Water Assessment Program and asked them, are you talking to the other group of people, the other box? And the answer was, probably not. We've got our set of goals, and we go ahead and pontificate, do this, and the professionals don't respond to that, or the professionals don't have an influence on that. And so how do you deal with something as complex as this unless everybody's into the act? Which leads to the cross-boundary, the municipal, the whole issue of who is in charge of this precious resource, whether it be here in the United States or is overseas. We argue, if you really want to get into an argument and have wars, go to California and see how when people talk about reallocation of the water in the reservoirs in the Sierra, everybody is willing to go to court, go to jail, bring out their shotguns. The same thing happens in other places in the world. We've got to have good answers to that. Just imagine dealing with multiple municipalities, how difficult. We cannot work out Houston, Texas, and all the municipalities that contribute to the water flow into downtown Houston. How is a country overseas with multiple religious groups, a culture that says that some groups aren't represented, how are they going to deal with that? Who's going to deal with that? The management, and we need that kind of management. And then lastly is the management capacity that's behind all of this. Some are well-trained and really of great interest in everything they do. They're looking at it from an altruistic standpoint, and others respond only to the needs of their superiors. We were talking before this started about the idea that you can go in and meet some really great people who know a lot about this, and then you see their boss come in, and the boss is, in a political sense, with a different focus, a different vision, and a different idea as to where you're going to go. And can you get management that's effective under those circumstances? The last part is we don't know all the answers. We keep saying that we do, but as you know, climate change is pretty difficult to predict. And when we're talking about water stress, we're talking about precipitation. Pick up any document that talks about this, and we say there's going to be changes. But you can get into a pretty good fight anywhere in the world when you say, well, we're going to have more or less, and what's more or less mean? And always in this issue is the issue of timing. When is it going to be available to whom and under what circumstances? So how do we deal with that, and how do we then move ahead? We've got to figure out a way to get our science fully funded to deal with these issues and to work with the world community to deal with such issues so that we together, and there are all sorts of methods that are being developed from artificial intelligence on, but we've got to get them in the hands of the managers at these other locations, including our own, so that we in effect can deal with these unknowns and improve the quality of the management. So very quickly, there's lots of challenges, and I believe we can solve the water physical problems, pollution and allocation and the issue of quantity, if in fact we have good management. And that's got to be something that we can help others attain, and where we have some experience, but we're not always perfect.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. And it's clear that water is a reflection of the forces shaping society, as many of you who working in this field particularly know. Let's turn to Sarah now, who, as Undersecretary, I understand dealt with some of these water stress issues directly in regions also experiencing violent extremism, like Lake Chad. So, Sarah, could you share with us how your experience, how water shaped some of the work you did as Undersecretary?
Sure. Julia talked a bit about the challenges in the Lake Chad Basin, and in many ways, that's a prism through which the broader issues that I confronted in my role as the senior State Department official thinking about human security in a world in which we tend to think about state security, that I experienced in that role. And when I would go to a given country that was facing conflict, I came with the hat of civilian security, but I didn't come, bless you, with the tools that other pieces of either the State Department or the U.S. government came with. And so I'm going to come back to this issue about how we as a government sort of see and frame programs after first stepping through my own experience. So if I went to a region of conflict, or if I was talking to the president of Chad or cabinet officials in Nigeria about the problems around the Lake Chad Basin, they would talk about Boko Haram, right? They would talk about the violence. But as the conversation unfolds, they talk about the broader range of vulnerabilities for persons in that region. So they'll talk about poverty, they'll talk about dramatic population growth, they'll talk about the dramatic changes that have occurred both in precipitation and in terms of how the Lake Chad Basin Commission has or has not been managing collective water resources. They'll talk about a bunch of things that we tend to think of as either stressors or push factors or vulnerabilities. But their primary focus is on the hard security implications and the war against Boko Haram. That's where they start. They don't even start with the primary concern about alleviating the human suffering in that region. So, the way I think about the connection between climate and a host of other problems, that if you're a demographer, you see the problems in that region as probably being born of uncontrolled population growth. If you're a climate person, you're looking at the dramatic decrease in the acreage and the quality of the water resources in Lake Chad, which, as Julia said, have had untold consequences in terms of population movements, in terms of the change in the forms of agriculture now reinforcing the environmental degradation as we move to grazing and the deforestation, not the deforestation, but the descrubization of the area. I mean, these are cyclical things that go on, but if you're a climate person, that's the lens you see it. If you're a governance person, you look at it from both the neglect and the marginalization aspects, particularly through the Nigerian lens, but it's also true of Cameroon and Chad and everybody else. So So you can scope these problems in a variety of ways, and there's nobody who goes into an in-depth conversation about the challenge of Boko Haram without touching on climate as a factor. But as Julia says, how you see linkage and causality really depends on the lens through which you look at the problem. But this brings me back to where I started, which is when I went to the Lake Chad region, I was looking at it from a human security perspective and seeing a variety of these factors. But I didn't work on development, that was AID. And I didn't work even on the environmental issues. Even within state, that's a different department. And then within the US government as a whole, we know it's not a priority of our foreign policy apparat in terms of the actual commitment of resources and dollars to deal with climate issues, water resource management. And so for us as a government, when I look at the issue, and I think the report is incredibly valuable because it is both a broad framework for looking at the problem. It provides enough examples of how the problem is manifest at the different levels of spectrum of conflict that you just described, Julia. But it also suggests that we have a failure to think about these problems comprehensively. But everybody's doing triage. It's not just the president of Chad who's doing triage. Everybody's doing triage. And triage means we're trying to think about humanitarian assistance and we're trying to defeat the rebels. And for all those governments, that's an antecedent to long-term efforts to address the water problems, which are just one of the many problems in the region. And so we see it's this scrum. And so for me, what's really jumps out of the report and what jumped out of my reflecting on my own efforts to try to interface with this problem through a small perch within the broader US government is that essentially this is a problem of a holistic prevention approach. And our government is much more geared toward dealing with symptoms. We don't prioritize and resource, we don't organize ourselves conceptually or in terms of our bureaucracy to work on prevention, let alone prevention in a collective context. You guys were talking about the difficulties of collective approaches to these problems, which ultimately are so important. And so most of the efforts that we actually need to address this problem that the report is so helpfully pointing out has huge national security implications in terms of first, second, and third order effects, but over a long period of time, is that the tools that we need are largely non-military tools from largely non-military actors, but it seems like in our current context of conceptualizing national security, the only people who can make that case convincingly are the people who have the hard security expertise. And so I think that is just such an important contribution of the work. Not only is it analytically rich and compelling, but it points to challenging our conceptions of what we need to invest in order to address the security issue.
Well, Sarah, that was brilliantly insightful as always. So you've been, an analyst, you have been an academic, and then you're sharing your experience having been a practitioner. And, it strikes me that some years ago we were talking about whole of government approaches in order to marshal development, diplomacy, and national security in support of some broader effort, which, as you noted, continues to have its shortfalls. But you've essentially pointed out we need even more than that. It's sort of a whole of governance approach because we are still not bringing in sort of the humanitarian with the economic, with the political, with the environmental elements together. Now, what is your how do you see this kind of effort being able to have some impact in changing that dynamic going forward, now that you've had that experience inside and now you're back out again?
Well, this may not be the political moment for being particularly hopeful about the recipe that I will outline, but I think that that one of the biggest challenges facing the United States as the globe's leader, which I believe it still is, but facing all countries and facing international governance mechanisms writ large, is the ability to think about stewardship and prevention in broad brush. And that is something that when we are facing challenges and scarcity, we are less likely to do, but it is more important to do.
Right, and that's part of what the Sustainable Development Goals overall are intended to drive, right? And so could you reflect on whether those at all were meaningful to you in your work, or?
Well, they came out, the revised goals came out at the very end, and that was when they began to insert security into the equation, which I think is a hugely fruitful phenomenon. But, just look at where we are in the United States, where we're talking about putting more money into national defense. We're not talking about even sustaining levels of our investment in diplomacy. Now, in the challenges that are described in the report, which is a more important investment? We're talking about the need for thought leadership, the need to galvanize action, the need to exhort other governments to think differently about the problem, to govern differently. Those are not military tools. Those are tools that require engagement led by the State Department, but supported by other elements of the U.S. and done in a collective frame. But that's not our instinct for how we need to respond to a changing security environment right now. So there's a huge cognitive disconnect right now in how we think about securing ourselves and the logical implications that flow from deep and considered analysis of the fundamental problems that the globe faces.
Okay, so nobody better than to bring that all together than Susie with your work on global trends. The work has been phenomenal. We've all really benefit from global trends. Perhaps you could reflect, Susie, on the connections between this report on water stress and the global trends work, and kind of where you think you might want to go in this area and be able to address these connections in the future.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you for including the NIC in this conversation, and I want to congratulate Julia and colleagues for a tremendous report. I think it was a very digestible unpacking of the issues at hand, and I think it lays out, just as Sarah said, the type of strategic framing that's needed for then the policy, the action community to begin to have the conversation that Sarah is encouraging us to have. The global trends effort, for those of you who are probably familiar, it's been something that the NIC started about 20 years ago in an effort to understand the key trends and uncertainties shaping the strategic landscape of the future. It is one of the few occasions that we have within the U.S. intelligence community where we step back and we actually try to put everything together. So we're very, very good at salami slicing, at getting to actionable intelligence for military and diplomatic needs, but very rarely do we step back and actually reconstitute the whole. And that's what Global Trends is. It's an effort to do that. And the reason we do that is that we think that a good faith, neutral assessment of those key trends and uncertainties, and then some judgments about the strategic landscape to come, can assist our policymakers and strategists with the development of national strategy, and then country and functional strategies that are then derived from that national statement. And so we've just had in the last 2 months the release of the national security strategy as well as the national defense strategy, and then of course the subsequent DoD documents in terms of nuclear posture have also come out. Those documents have as their analytic starting point global trends. All of these steps are hard. The really hard part is getting to where Sarah has encouraged us to go, and that's why I appreciate, Sherry, your question about where the NIC is headed here. So, for us, our cycle analytically is okay. Assess the future. We've done that. We've taken 2.5 years to do it. Now, in this period of implementation, we're getting all sorts of questions about well, what are success stories that we might be able to learn from if we have customers in the current administration who are really committed to alleviating water stress? What cases might we learn from? And that is, you could imagine that question across the board in terms of global health issues, in terms of transportation and infrastructure issues, a whole bevy of development questions, obviously questions about strategic competition. There's a dearth of rigorous research, frankly, on successful policy interventions and successful governance models. And so that's where I would encourage those of you who are researchers in the room, whether from the policy side, the security side, or the environmental side, is to direct some of your energies towards the success stories. I'm a real believer in the work of the MAB and others who have identified climate and environmental drivers as threat multipliers, but they're also benefit multipliers when when we have adequate governance interventions. And so my team and I are quite literally on the search for those positive governance interventions. And I'm also a trained social scientist, so I'm a big believer in variation. The whole world isn't crappy, okay? Like just right, there are some places that are nice to live. Let's learn from them, right? And I think that's spending a little bit of time on the optimistic side of things can give us some tangible insights to be able to plug into human security initiatives, as well as hard security initiatives. So that's just my encouragement for all of you to join the NIC and join others that are in this space, is to really be able to identify these examples of innovation in governance, success stories against all odds, doing so with rigorous social science and research design, so that we have inferences that we can then build policy upon. I just want to say a couple of things about the global trends, the specific findings in the global trends work to address some of the questions that have been put on the table here. Why do we think it's going to get worse in terms of water stress? There are three key drivers that we're paying attention to. One, of course, are climate and environmental drivers. It is clear to us that the planet is warming, that we have a series of extreme weather phenomenon that are exacerbating livelihoods now and have been for some time. This is accelerating stresses on communities, both rural communities as well as urban communities in the developing world and the advanced industrial world. Taking a step back and thinking about U.S. policy on this, development policy specifically has traditionally been directed towards rural communities. And so the Global Trends Report, we're really happy to be a part of this conversation with USAID and others internationally, has put some attention on the need for urban development policy and revitalizing that space. So that's one driver in terms of amplifying the water stresses. Another driver, of course, is the rise of the global middle class, in part because of the rise of China and successful developing world economies. We expect that trend line to continue. However, the core ingredients of that economic growth are shifting before our eyes because of technology and some other factors as well. But as those ingredients shift, the reliability of those growth rates is giving some in our community some pause about whether that great reduction of poverty around the world will continue or even sustain the gains that it's made. And so there's real concern about some backsliding in certain parts of the developing world in terms of recent gains. And then the third driver to talk about, we've talked about environment and we've talked about economics, are the political pieces of this, the governance shortfalls that co-panelists here have identified. As we have more empowered individuals expecting greater say in the life of their communities and their states, it's becoming beyond apparent that many of those political institutions and economic arrangements are inadequate in terms of responding to the demands for greater participation and greater responsiveness to communities. And so that gets me back to my first point about encouraging all of us who are committed to this issue to think long and hard about successful governance models of the future, being able to deal with individual empowerment, uncertain economic growth patterns, and of course this very difficult set of environmental stressors that we're facing. Learning from history here is one part of it, but frankly, learning from today and tomorrow's problem solvers, I think, is more important. It's just getting out there and learning from them. And that's part of our business model with the Global Trends Project, is to go around the world, find these people, and figure out what they're doing, and try to derive some generalizable insights from it. So that's our agenda to come, and I hope those of you who are interested in it, please knock on my door and be a part of it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Susie. That was brilliant. And let me observe on your query on the success models, and then we'll turn to our panel. One successful model of addressing water insecurity that we recognized here at the Wilson Center just recently is EcoPeace Middle East, that's working a partnership with Israel, Lebanon, and the Palestinian Authority to address water stress issues affecting all three of those entities, and to come up with solutions on the borders that enable better water sharing, better water cooperation, and address the water security issues. And so that, despite the tensions that continue to exist in that region, it's actually been one of the bright spots and one of the possible models of cooperative governance on water going forward. But I will also ask the panelists if they have any success stories to share here.
I'd like to actually jump in. I haven't been thinking of success stories. I may come up with one eventually, but I'd just like to offer just a response to some of the panelists' comments, if I may. So, Sarah, I appreciate that you went right to the prevention piece, because I live in the world of kind of low-end threats and these complex local conditions that are driving conflict in the world today, and I struggle a lot with when I'm talking to a 2-star or 3-star, or 4, that's my world, that's where I interact with okay, Julia, I know these are important, you've told me they're important, but I'm not getting the link to what do I do about it. And it was great being part of the MAB, because they really pushed on this, being former military leaders on, I know there's a problem, I see there's a problem, but I need you to tell me what the DoD can do about it. And Sarah, I thought you put it perfectly and kind of captured some of the frustration that I and others, face trying to create these convincing narratives for DoD leadership that empower them to convince their leadership that these things matter and resources should be put behind them. So, I'm encouraged to hear, Susie, that you found value in this, and you see that can kind of start to influence those types of discussions. But I do agree, now that you pointed out, that the success stories are lacking. I mean, that's absolutely true. And those are the types of things that can be convincing when policymakers are trying to get resources to change a course of action. So I appreciate that.
The Defense Department is continually finding itself in the position of dealing with unfolding circumstances that are the result of the collection of influences we're talking about today. We have, throughout the reports of the Military Advisory Board, stressed the importance of, I don't want to call it soft power, that seems to diminish its importance, but diplomacy and development have always been key to the arguments that we made, not just to the whole of government, but also specifically to the Defense Department. The Defense Department must advocate for the partnerships that are so important around the world with the State Department, with USAID in particular. And so the Defense Department can have a prayer of dealing less with the consequences and more in anticipating the conditions that will be difficult for people to live in and helping them contend with those conditions rather than have the situation degenerate.
Jerry?
I would offer that I think that where we can provide a facilitation capability to countries and get them to come together, our National Academy has a program in Resilience for the Nation, Resilient America Roundtable. And one of the things they do, they find that while you can't get people to talk to each other from the local area, if you come down and say, we're going to have a meeting, they'll get together and talk. And for the first time, they'll cross lines. I look at Aaron Salzberg out there, and I think of the Lower Mekong Initiative. Mekong is very complex, but the fact that we're there and that we bring donors with us and we bring commercial partners with us, NGOs, these people each have a way into the community. And I think if we were to look more closely at places like the Mekong, we would see that, first of all, China is now talking more to them about what's happening in the upper Longsan, the upper Mekong. Burma is now listening with an ear towards what's happening in their country, plus the Mekong where it intersects their country. So there are things that can be done. The challenge is to get people to think beyond tomorrow or the end of my term, because the issues we're talking about fundamentally are 10, 20 years ahead. The problem we're finding with the MAB reports, and people say, well, why are you worried about that? That's 2035. Well, if you want to program something to be built, if you want to recognize the challenge, then you've got to start thinking about it now, get it in the pipeline, and get it moving. About 15 years ago, Aspen did a study called Silent Tsunami, which talked about the water problem, WASH, but it pointed out that let's worry about that in the villages, but everybody is flowing into Dhaka, and they're flowing into these big cities, Mumbai. What is a water system you're going to be able to have that's effective in the year 2030? And you need to start building it now. Don't put all your money here when you need to do it there. There are people that are beginning to do that. Sao Paulo came out of their great water crises thinking about the future, and we need to find examples like that where we are actually seeing people who have encountered, and maybe Cape Town will come up with that, have encountered this specter and are moving ahead to solve it now.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So the report recommends developing a common Foresight tool to identify areas of emerging water stress. Can you address what would be the elements of such a tool? Do you think it includes the concepts that are emerging in the science and technology community to address seasonal to subseasonal forecasting, which is going to close the gap between weather, short-term weather, 1-week weather prediction, and longer-term climate change by enabling us to have more reliable tools to do 2-week to 2-month subseasonal prediction or 2 months to 12 months seasonal prediction. Is that the type of tool that the report is recommending, or are there others? And I'd be particularly interested, kind of, Susie, in how you think about it, but it's really to the whole panel.
Do you want to start, Julia? Sure. In terms of
So, and various members of the MAB, I think, have different ideas of what this should look like. So it's kind of starting a conversation. I mean, you gave a lot of different options. So, I mean, from where I sit, I think about the combatant commands, the geographic combatant commands, and what type of tool could exist so that those combatant commands become aware of a water or water stress related potential crisis that would require some type of humanitarian or disaster assistance. Or could, one thing we didn't really talk about is water stress as something that can trigger events that themselves aren't destabilizing, but could put into motion a series of events that eventually are. So could a tool that I think for a combatant command would need to be fairly simple, but something like the famine management system, and that's not the
Like FUSE. Like
yeah, exactly.
A broader base version
Yep.
of the famine early warning system that covered more elements
I think so,
and went across the spectrum.
and went
of
around the
conflict.
spectrum. And I think a key component of it would be it would allow a conversation between the COCOM, the U.S. government, and the government in the country being impacted or affected, because a lot of the management responses are going to come naturally from that government. So how do you open that line of communication about a potential water stress related event?
The UK, for a number of years, has been running Foresight exercises, and they have looked at the whole issue of climate change, certainly an inundation on the coastline, and they're reacting to it. Now, theirs is scenario-based, and there are probably other methods that are as good, or not better, with doing that, but they've done it on a structured basis, and people do two things. They read it, and then they start taking action. And any Foresight tool that is that's put out and the results are given to somebody, there's got to be a reaction to it, because just having a report that sits on the shelf isn't going to be very useful. So if we have the new science, we have all the work that NOAA is doing and NASA is doing, we combine that with what we know about the political system, what's going on. If we could find a way to do that that deals specifically with water in developing countries, the UK has a benefit in that they have all this information already there from thousands of years of knowledge of that particular area. But there are things that could be done, and there are good examples using tools like Foresight to move ahead.
I think there's a whole range of tools here to be thinking about in terms of equipping both communities as well as national policymakers as well and international, those in the international governance space. The forecasting models in terms of looking near term, whether that's a few weeks out or out to maybe the midterm, 2 to 5 years out, in the instability space have really matured quite dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years. And a little bit of history here. For those of you who've followed this work, in the Clinton administration, Vice President Gore actually commissioned CIA or tasked the agency to build an instability forecasting model that at the time was called the State Failure Task Force, and later Political Instability Task Force. But one of the key questions of that was, how is environmental stress a contributor to instability, large-scale instability? And the work of that program has continued to investigate that question, where social scientists have run up against a bit of a bottleneck and problem that new data capabilities are breaking through, is the country as the unit of analysis, as well as the year as the unit of analysis. So that is a really crude forecast. They're really accurate forecasts, but they're super crude. And so that gives you an annual watch list that, okay, I get a sense of who's vulnerable and who isn't. Trying to marry that type of work with more granular observational data down to the square kilometer, those are capabilities that are now available from the environmental science communities. And there's real potential, I think, for those seeking PhD topics to build those methodologies, because the data are becoming more and more available. And it's not, in the grand scheme of things, not terribly expensive to build it. There's another type of tool, I think, that our practitioners within communities and actually residents of communities could benefit from. And these are fairly simple checklist type tools that I know our development and diplomats and military folks utilize, where we essentially just ask a series of questions about political, economic, environmental, and other forms of societal stress in a community. And that does a very good job of identifying the current issues of the day, as well as anticipating what could come. And that can be scaled to geography, whether it's a small town or it's province, a country, and so forth. That's kind of old-fashioned field research, but it's very effective in putting all of the issues on the table into the sort of holistic conversation that Sarah and Julia were talking about before.
Okay, great. Those were great comments. Okay, we're going to start with questions over on this side, this gentleman right here, and then right behind it, and then we'll kind of work our way around the room here.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jed Schilling, and I work
Introduce
with,
yourself, please, and your affiliation.
well, I say I'm Jed Schilling, and I work with 2 NGOs now that deal with many of these issues, the Millennium Institute and the Mountain Institute. With the Millennium Institute, in relation to this recent discussion, we've developed over the number of years an integrated system dynamic model that links economic, social, environmental factors and can take account of many of these interactions that you've been talked about, and we've applied the model to many countries. And the factor with water is a resource that we depend upon, but we depend upon it not only for drinking, but for growing food, for industrial production, for energy generation, and those different uses can compete with it when it starts getting in low volume. So the model can incorporate that and look at it, and we can do it regionally to look at the problems like in the Mekong Delta or in Africa or places like that, how various things interact. So it's a very useful tool to look at these things. With the Mountain Institute, that's very concerned about protecting mountain ecosystems, and they've done a project working on this about the world's water towers, because 60% of our fresh water comes from mountains, so it's very important to protect the mountain areas as watersheds and things like that. And they've done projects to encourage people in mountains to protect the watershed and reduce the flow downstream. And a couple of interesting studies have come out. One, which is actually in a New York Times article recently, about Peru, where the melting glaciers due to climate change are creating excessive water flow down into the lower plains. So farmers are expanding their irrigation and doing a lot of stuff, which looks good. But in about 20 years, the water runs out. And so then they're going to face real problems, and they're talking about building dams. But this is a case where the dams will want to do the hydropower in the winter season, and the farmers want the water to come down
Do you
in
have
the
a
summer season.
question for the panel?
Yeah, and I have another interesting story. I heard
Well,
another
we
water.
have a lot. I
company-
see a lot of hands go up here, so we're going to try to keep the
Well,
comments brief.
I'm happy
and
to
the
talk about
questions.
any of this stuff further,
we
but this
clearly
is
you
how
are an
these things
expert.
interact and how they go. And the question I want, which is not related to what I was just talking about so much, but in supplying water, only 3% of the water in the world is fresh water. And only 1% of that is available because the other 2% are in glaciers. What do you think about shifting to more desalination, and is it feasible to find enough sources of water to meet the many conflicting demands, or do we have to do very serious restructuring of our economic and political activities?
Okay, I think we'll take two questions at a time. So the gentleman right there, and then we'll ask the panel to answer.
Hi, I'm Bud Rock from Global Water 2020. I have would like to respond to something that Julia raised with a question. I'd like to know what you all think about the future of the AID DoD civilian military cooperation activities. The reason why I asked the question is that, Julia, you referred to the work of the COCOMs, and we have been looking at what the COCOMs can do in the water and health arena. And it seems that what we're finding is that the authority exists within the COCOMs to do this work, and there are examples of work being done to address water stresses and health-related issues in individual COCOMs. What seems to need to be supported, or what's needed to drive this issue, is a uniform message across COCOMs that could come through the AID DoD civilian military cooperation. It's hard for, I think, DoD to get engaged in activities in the region without incorporating the aid missions at the same time. So I'm interested in how that relationship is likely to work in the future.
Okay, question about desalinization opportunities and civilian military USAID DoD cooperation.
On the desalinization piece, I think if we ask the Israelis whether there are prospects there or not, they would certainly resoundingly say yes. This is a case where energy and water are inextricably linked. It takes an awful lot of energy to desalinate, whatever, to make potable water out of seawater or out of polluted water. The key here, I think, or a key, is a transition to advanced energy. In fact, combustion energy and nuclear power both have great demands for water. It doesn't have to be in every circumstance fresh, but in many cases, certainly for combustion energy, it is. So one of the downsides of moving from coal to natural gas is that natural gas still demands water for cooling. The more rapidly we get to advanced energy, I think the better we're going to be in terms of ability to satisfy the needs of the rising middle class, and also answer the demands for energy that will come from increasing the use of desalinization.
Well stated, Lee. On the USAID,
I can offer just some observations kind of over the course of my research for this project, are that at the COCOM level, a lot of the water work, there is some water-related work, but it's kind of piecemeal and kind of a single grant, a one-off type program. And some different agencies, are involved, and so there is no, as you rightly stated, coordinated, cooperative, cross-DoD type effort on the water stress. But it's really part of the goal of this whole effort is to try to help folks like us and folks like you weave that narrative together so that we show that there is a convincing case why that type of coordination is necessary. And even though it may not be DoD specific tools and resources that are applied to the problem set in coordination and conjunction with U.S. aid, which does have a lot of the tools to work these issues, it's a win-win, and there should be, increasing cooperation coordination on the issue. So an opportunity we potentially have, with this report now is to kind of go out and have those conversations at the COCOM level and potentially in DOD, to kind of start that discussion. So I'd love to talk to you afterwards if you'd like about that.
Sarah, I know you have observations, particularly on how was AFRICOM, which is supposed to be this integrated, heavy soft power with USAID and even NOAA assignee detailees resident in the command, as well as, of course, diplomats and the military expertise. How do they play in your work in the region and other observations?
Well, I don't want to put a damper on anything that helps solve a problem, but I do think that there is a real danger that I saw in my 3 years. I left government. I had been at DOD as a DASD for peacekeeping left in '96, returned in 2014 to government, and was astonished by the amount of activity that was run by DOD, often through AID, that was what I would consider to be traditional work that should have been led by the State Department. And I think there is a risk, and I say this, I love the COCOMs, but I think there is a risk that the COCOMs, the stewardship model, the time frame for a COCOM thinking about a problem related to a lot of these long-term stressors is different from the time frame of an AID and is different from the time frame of a State Department. And I know that the COCOMs are seeking to have, you see this in the development space all the time, which is essentially the military view is I want a quick impact project. And that is not the answer that we need for the problems that we're talking about. And so AID is happy to take DOD's money to do quick impact projects, and they will call it something as in a mid frame, and they'll look for funding to make it long frame. But I think there's a risk in thinking about the more exigent military time frame responses to these problems. And again, I think we are using the resources that are available, but the fundamental problem is, I would argue we don't have the resources in the right place in the right agencies. So I think that is, how long are we going to do these workarounds and say that we're actually working? But I think there's a different issue that has to do with the global governance piece. And even though so many of these solutions are regional and local, as Susie said, the reality is that even the State Department in the U.S. is not going to have a stewardship model and a time frame for global resource management. At the end of the day, this needs to be a partnership between those that locally own the problem and then the international systemic responses that can enable more local responses. Whether you're talking about this as an intra-governmental problem, a governance problem, or a local problem. So the bottom line of what I'm trying to say is that I think we need to recognize that our attention is going to move, and we're not necessarily the people with the answers, and we need to try to think about equipping the UN and international actors to partner with the people who own the problem. So UNDP, Lake Chad, UNDP is in there trying to do relief development nexus work that's sustainable. The Food and Agricultural Organization is trying to teach people how to either fish or farm using less water, right? Those are things that can continue with the local actors, that can continue over a longer time frame. What they require is for the United States as a global leader to say, these should be an important IFI priority for the bank or for the fund, and they should be talking to governments about what they need to do. And that needs to then reinforce what the UN agencies are doing that come more from a relief and symptomatic addressing phenomenon, but they may be the only actual activity happening on the ground in these difficult areas. So we need to be saying this is an important agenda item, and we're going to fund it. And we're going to urge other people to fund it because we know our attention is going to flit and our priorities are going to differ. So we're going to invest in a longer term view that doesn't purport to have all the answers, but that purports to help the people who need to solve the problem.
I'm observing some of that happening now in the EU and Europe, where there's been a more deliberate focus on
Investing in international institutions.
Exactly. Okay, we're going to go to this side of the room. I see Mitzi and the woman next to her, and then the gentleman behind. We'll take those three questions, and then we'll come back here to the middle of the room.
Thank you. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. There's so many issues that sort of come blasting in. One is the personnel systems in organizations where the objective of the military is basically to defeat the other. And how do you get this whole concept of cooperation built into the way they think? And my other question is, how are you going to educate? What is your plan for educating the rest of the country as to how important this is? Where are you going to get shows like this on television, articles in all the publications? It's an amazing story you guys have pulled together, and I want the whole country and the world to understand it. So you've got a real challenge ahead of you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sydney Roeder, and I'm with the Arab Center, but I used to work for EcoPeace Middle East, so I appreciate the shout out. My question is directed at General Galloway. You mentioned it a little bit when you talked about Bolivia, and that's the use of private institutions in the management of water. Can you talk a little bit to the feasibility of water privatization as an effective water management strategy moving forward?
We're going to take one more question, then we're going to answer these three. Gentlemen, back there.
Sure, this kind of dovetails onto that. To give Julia
And your name?
Kevin Mulligan, founder of Power 7. This goes back to Julia's point, looking for success stories. 1986, USAID gave a contract to a very small company that drilled 3 wells in Borama, Somaliland. Produced 1 million gallons of water a day. It has been for 31 years, potable water. That's supported 104,000 people in that local population for mixed use. So I think if you're looking for a success, that's it. Power 7 takes that same technology. We go to the Federal Minister of Water Resources in Nigeria, get knee to knee with him, talking to him about Buhari's priority to revitalize agribusiness, the Boko Haram activity in the northeastern states, the Chad River Basin issues. But we're taking the same technology, the same lessons that were supported by USAID in 1986 to the issue in Nigeria. My question is really, because what we're trying to do is commercial diplomacy. As a former Marine, as someone who's worked in the region that these gentlemen have worked in during their military careers and talking with combatant commanders, seeing the limitations of those cross-boundary issues, I got out of the Marine Corps to specifically form this company, to specifically address water, because it is the leading indicator of unrest. It is the canary in the coal mine. And so my question to you is, how do small businesses, using their commercial diplomacy, how do they partner with CNA, these organizations, in a meaningful way, where as a small business, we're not really on the radar of a Department of State or USAID. We're not on the radar of the World Bank, global water, the global water policy, the global water practice. We're not on their radar, but we can be extremely effective when literally I am sitting knee to knee with the Minister of Water Resources of Nigeria. He is listening to what I'm telling him. He's willing to accept some of the inputs that I'm giving him on management issues. And we are having a very candid conversation about water because it's non-threatening as a small business. So I'd love your feedback on that. I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, 3 questions. Education and communication. Jerry, you got a specific question there, and then small business opportunities in this space.
Well, a quick answer to the one that wasn't directed to me. Having been the dean at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, we did a national strategy seminar, and the students were much more interested in getting more money in diplomacy, being able to deal with these sorts of issues. They're ready to carry that message forward. They just need the support of the administration overall, and this was during the Clinton administration, that we really wanted to see money spent where it would cut problems off at their knees, i.e. things like we're talking about water stress. And they would certainly agree that they have a role in doing that, in talking that up. The second question I would answer quickly is, part of the problem with privatization is seeing all the cards. In Cochabamba, they didn't see all the cards. People who have to, when you negotiate this, people have to understand what it really costs to do it. What is the challenge you're facing with privatization? Who's going to be in charge in the long run? Can you really afford that, and are you prepared to take the steps that make it affordable? And unions are a major challenge anytime you go to privatization of water systems. And do you have a plan for the future, and how will this be incorporated in it? I mean, you say, again, the simple answer to most is build a dam. But a dam then brings several other problems with it. And so everybody needs to see what's on the table, and then you can go from there.
With regard to Mitzi's question about education, I think we have viewed part of our mission from the beginning in the Military Advisory Board as educating our colleagues who remain in uniform. And also, I think we've found that they're very receptive to these kinds of recommendations with regard to cooperation and long-term projects as well. One thing we tell our colleagues who are still serving is that your budget is your strategy, and you should stop talking about paying for things and start talking about investing in things, because it conveys the notion that there'll be some return on investment, and it also changes the shape of your thinking. Educating the rest of the country, Mitzi, thanks for that question. You know that this is an opportunity for me to say that the Military Advisory Board packs its bags after each one of these things and hits the road. And Jerry and I and a dozen other members of the now 30-plus Military Advisory Board flag and general officers have been on the road regularly for the last more than a decade, talking in the United States, across the United States, and in fact internationally, about the conclusions we draw and the ideas we have for the future and the necessity, the urgency of dealing with these issues.
Could I just make one more? So one thing, and this is kind of in a response to actually to all of the questions, but one thing that I didn't really touch on in our findings was that the kind of end of our story is that when you look across the world and you look at water stress and where it exists, it really emerged to me that it was surprising about how much of it really does have to do with the management piece and effective management. And it's about agriculture and irrigation and not overdrawing aqueducts and so on and so forth. As a conflict researcher, this is actually a very optimistic note to end on. Because if you think of it that way, and to your point about water being something that is universally needed, right? I mean, there's nothing contentious about water. So it opened, both of those things, in my view, kind of open apertures that aren't available in a lot of other areas to actually make progress and to see success stories and to look on the more optimistic side of things. So I'm encouraged to hear your story, and I think in the report, those are the kinds of things that we're saying, need to be happening, but carefully in ways that don't cause unintended consequences that we've seen in the past, particularly with drill digging in Africa. We've heard a lot of those stories, but yeah, so that's kind of.
Can I just add 2 cents to this this point about how to share the story, but also for those of us who are in the education business, to see those education moments as learning opportunities. So much of what we do with the Global Trends Project is actually in response to these little micro learning moments or aha moments where people say it's an organization like Power 7 where we learn about it, and then we're in a position to be able to see, oh, there's another organization like this, and we begin to build some patterns. And so I think as your organization here is going around the country, it's a two-way dialogue, and it's a two-way learning experience. And I think I've been really privileged within my role in the U.S. government to see our diplomats and development officers, as well as those in the military, engage in that practice. I think for those of us in the USG, though, the challenge, though, is institutionalizing and capturing that knowledge and then sharing it amongst ourselves in a way that you can see tangible effects and returns. And so it's hard, but it's a two-way process, is my point. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just add, one of the trends I have seen emerge in the last decade is the rise of accelerators and incubators for innovative businesses, even in this space. For example, USIP convened something they call the Peace Tech Accelerator, which has got private sector investors and others, and they bring companies maybe like yours together, a dozen at a time, a couple times a year, and they get a training and they get sort of introduction across many sectors. And there's another one I think called TIDES. I forget what it stands for, but it's another one that's kind of in this sort of development in conflict spaces arena. Okay, let's see. I see Steve and the gentleman behind, Steve Brock, gentleman behind him, and then the woman in the corner there, those three.
Steve Brock, DOD. My question regards the price of water. We've talked about prevention and stewardship, privatization, management. The UN says that water is a human right. We've always had water, seen water as a public good. That comes with the resource, the natural resource, being virtually free to the end user, because if you look at the price of water, it doesn't reflect the real cost, and that lapse has led to mismanagement, waste, et cetera. So my question is, as far as governance, have we not allowed market forces to drive the price of water, which would cause us to be much better stewards of it? And that's sort of philosophical, but very fundamental question. And then you would ask for more examples of positive outcomes. Large environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy have been partnering with water-intensive industries around the developing world to have those industries invest in upland, forested regions of the watershed, coastal marshes, other marshes that have greatly improved water quality and the quantity of water in areas where great infrastructure would have been more costly and perhaps the capability wouldn't have been there to do it in the time frame that was needed. So I'd like just to have any views on green infrastructure and some of the things that are being done in that regard. Thanks.
Great.
Bob Eichord from the Atlantic Council. Hi, Sherry. How are you? My question relates, I think, to this issue of governance and institutional reform in the sector to ensure that you have the kind of integrated watershed management approach and upstream, downstream efforts that are necessary to solve these problems. And in this regards, I think that Morocco has some interesting characteristics, looking at the energy and water nexus in particular, in the sense that they've developed utility structure and policy framework that very much integrates the two. And I think, as we've talked before, I mean, both in terms of the decentralized energy aspects as well as the centralized and larger scale, the water issue and that nexus is becoming critical to deal with together as a policy and institutional framework. And in this regard, too, I think going back to the question of how do we get more resources into this area, if you look at the budget, if you see the proposal to really decimate the funding and combined ESF and DA, you've got a real problem. But health funding has maintained its largest share in the process. And it seems to me that if we're going to try to assure proper allocation of U.S. government resources, at least to this process, that you've got to look at the health budgets and how water and other factors integrate with health and how that can be used more effectively. Not that PEPFAR hasn't had accomplishments, but given the budget and realities that we face, I think you have to look at the health budget in terms of its potential to work in this area as well.
Hello, I'm Anne Solkovsky. Does anyone have anything to say to my niece who's writing her dissertation on, it's under the big umbrella of avian habitats, but it's titled Sierra Nevada Alpine Lake Ecology. She's very concerned, as a lover of birds, that someone or some organization is introducing non-native fish into the lakes that are depleting the food source of the birds. And I do have a second question. Where can I get this report to give to my neighbor, Lester Brown, who's working on his 55th book titled Something to Do with Water?
Okay. Good set of questions there, from green infrastructure to health. I think the reports are right outside, the answer to that question. Okay.
So I'll start with birds, and your niece writing her dissertation. I don't know anything about the habitats or ecology of the Sierra Nevada, but what I will say is that the NIC and its thinking about environmental security issues is turning next to threats to the biosphere. I think in layman's terminology, how I understand it, is biodiversity loss. And what happens to human security and frankly, you know, our lived environment, our ecology writ large, to include plants, animals, and humans, when we experience biodiversity loss at very significant scales. And so that's kind of thinking about that in the series of treatments that the NIC is offering on environmental issues that began with water, food, energy, climate change, and now turning to biosphere work. One of the big puzzles that we have for this is connecting those, the loss in biosphere diversity to direct and indirect effects on human well-being and in turn national security issues. So it's a big hypothesis we have, and we're poking around on it. So I encourage your niece to continue her work. But understanding that linkage between the animal and plant environment to the human environment is very important for us.
Thank you for that, sharing that. I'll just observe, and then I'll give Julie that, you know, one of the key fundamental forefront of research in this area is integrating the physical sciences with the human and social sciences, and that leading edge work is very important, and it's one of the areas of research that I personally have deep concern we get underinvested in, because it's easier to continue work that's in one particular lane than it is to do the integrative work across multiple disciplines.
No, I was just going to add on an administrative note that we are out of hard copies of the report, but it's available on the website, which is cna.org/MAB, M-A-B.
The issue of pricing, you could go to Phoenix and have an argument. You could go to Philadelphia and say, why are they paying more and why haven't we done something? It comes down to culture. I ran into this in Manila, where they had split the utility into private sector and public sector. And the amazing thing to the private sector is once they started this, heretofore people would just sort of tap into the water lines when they could and steal the water. And when they had the private and people were paying directly and could see that their money was going to support this, they became very concerned and were reporting their neighbors on a rather frequent basis for cheating on this. And they began to see this swing towards possession and realization of the costs of operation and in the long run the improvements that had to take place. Once you get that water in your house, then you want to think about more things you can do with it, enlarging it. So there's a lot to be said with education again, that people understand what it really means and what we're paying to do this. And the same thing that happened in Cochabamba.
I can say a word on
Okay.
health. One of the interesting phenomena in terms of the direction of the budget under the new administration is the extent to which it focuses on symptoms rather than causes. And, you know, even when I was in the Obama administration, PEPFAR had all the money, and so everybody wanted to do all their programming through PEPFAR, just like AID wants the money from DOD to do development work through the COCOMs, because that's where the money is. People go to the money. But apropos of the complexity of the issues that we've been talking about on this panel and the relationship between the reduction in the availability and quality and access to water and increasing demands on water, the biggest bang for the buck from a long-term stewardship model of health money would be family planning. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, then. John, and then I see a gentleman in the back. John Oldfield. Do you have a microphone for John Oldfield right here?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. John Oldfield with Global Water 2020. Just two quick questions. There is an existing interagency water working group chaired by the Department of State that may well be a very useful and even more useful vehicle for dealing with these longer term time frame challenges you guys are talking about up there. How do we, if the interagency water working group is a good idea, how do we elevate that? What can you guys do? What can we do? What is this an NSC ask? Is it a Congress ask? How do we further empower the activities of that interagency? And by that I do mean including money, financial and technical resources. Second question, Sarah, I'm awfully impressed with your thoughtfulness about this issue, and I think you approach it from an interesting standpoint. I wanted to drill down into financing. How do we get these IFIs, the international financial institutions, to prioritize prevention, to prioritize water security? It's awfully difficult to quantify the risks associated with something that hasn't yet happened. So look forward to your guidance on that. Thank you.
And then there's a gentleman in the back. Was it? No? Okay. All right, let's answer John's question.
So I think the question in terms of the interagency working group is does it matter, and can you make it matter, and can you make it matter without a budget behind it? Budget is a strategy. Couldn't agree more. And like so many things in this administration, I think there is a working level continuity on the part of civil servants who understand the long-term demands for U.S. leadership and the long-term threats and opportunities that we face as a country in a global system. And so that work continues. But whether or not it's important depends in part on what's above it and what it plugs into at the policy level and what's below it and what is available to it at the resource level. And I just don't know the specifics of how it fares. In terms of the global governance piece, one of the interesting things, the report does, I think, a very interesting job in building upon some of the models that I spent a couple years trying to reinvigorate and elevate at state to better understand the long-term security threats through the lens of these drivers of vulnerability and the ways in which populations become vulnerable to violent extremism. That in some ways is sort of the sexiest method to unpack and elevate vulnerabilities, because people relate it to terrorism, and it suggests, I think falsely in many cases, but an important impetus for action because of an implied connection. But the question of water also, I think, is something that can be elevated in the context of, as Sherry was talking about, Europe is now focused largely because of population flows with the migration crisis really in 15 and beyond, as it has faced the needs of so many people fleeing areas in which they either feel unsafe or unable to live safely. And water, of course, or absence of water is one, again, of a many complex factors that drive that like terrorism as a motivating issue becomes an issue of global migration on a massive scale, and we can only predict that will increase over time. So I think for the international financial institutions, they've already begun entering this avenue of prioritizing questions of governance, questions of access to resources and marginalization, and questions of available resources, whether economic or natural. They've begun wading into this territory, and they may have other apertures that I'm less familiar with in which they're already doing it. So taking it a step further, I don't think is a far piece. I think they're having trouble figuring out how within their internal organizational structure to mainstream it. But I think that is a question of time, and it's really sort of a bureaucratic and leadership question. So I think what remains the opportunity for the United States is to impress, as one of the major funders of these institutions, the importance of elevating this as an organizing principle for their work and elevating it in the context of thinking about conditionality. I have long believed that what we've taken as the sort of economic orthodoxies of conditionality need to be expanded, because it's these big muscle movements. We can talk about private direct investment, which is the biggest muscle movement going forward, but these are the biggest internationally governed muscle movements. And so we need to try to use the vehicles that we have. The U.S. as a global leader does that through exhortation and thought leadership. But I think it's groups like this one that are doing the critical role in goosing the government to try to think differently about its global leadership. So I think we've got a bunch of different sort of steps to move forward in trying to realize the possibility of better harnessing these larger muscle movements on the international front.
Okay, I have another question. Then we have two in the back, but I have a question that builds on Sarah, what you just said, which is, so the administration released a global water strategy not long ago, which addresses many of the issues that we're talking about, including the need to advance cooperation on key water stress areas. How would you advise, let me ask the members of the MAB and Julia, how would you advise the administration to use this, the findings and recommendations of this report to further implementation of the global water strategy?
Well, I think...
I want to answer that for the record.
Well, no, I think it's extremely important that people read it. That's the first thing. One of the challenges I've seen is, it goes back to the working group question of how do you get people together. We have lots of working groups with domestic water issues, and because they never can open the door to where the big discussion's going on, we don't really get that knowledge pushed forward. The same thing came out in the UN report on governance of water. The challenge is in what you're talking about here, we've got a global strategy. Do each of the secretaries know about it? Now, that's something that may be looking for too much, but they ought to be able to ask, and we need to find ways to get the higher levels of government to deal with these sorts of issues and not just assume that somebody else is taking care of them. If this is a big enough challenge, and having read the Global Water Strategy and having looked at this, we're pointing out some very serious issues. And so somehow we need to find the people, and some of them are at this table, who can tell the higher-ups in the government what they need to know. Once somebody told me that, well, the president's very busy and he's got a lot of balls in the air, he can only handle so many. I'd like him at least to see the ball go by. And so some of these issues like this, we really need to do. Somebody needs to say there's a new report and we need to incorporate it, and the State Department needs to help us sell this report along with their report as we move forward, because people are just not listening. We have a U.S. Water Resource Council. It's met twice in the last 20 years or something like that. Doesn't do very much for you.
Okay, well, I would observe when the first CNA Military Advisory Board report was released in 2007, we briefed it up the highest levels of the chain of command in DOD and in state, and there's no reason not to make that opportunity available now.
Exactly. I mean, that became, the threat multiplier became the buzzword.
You know, several of the members of the panel, sorry,
No, go ahead.
have alluded to what became the price question earlier. It seems to me that if private investment is to be enticed in dealing with the infrastructure issues that are necessarily going to have to be confronted in improving the water situation around the world, that the price question, I wish I had an answer for it, but I don't, but it has to be studied far more extensively than it has been so far. There's an interesting California, I'm a Californian at heart, interesting set of examples of pricing in California during the drought. And the penalty pricing that was associated with excessive use and the like. I think it would be useful to look at the cases, not only in California, but around the world, where pricing has been applied to supply that's certainly not universal, and there are not necessarily any consistencies among the approaches that have been taken, but that could be a virtue if we understand what the effects were when these causes were applied.
Well, I mean, Israel has done that since the birth of the nation, and
Sure.
one can look at the case of Israel where water has been seen as a core element of national power since the nation was founded.
Sure, good point.
And
I'll just make two observations on that point. The first is, I mean, this administration is clearly emphasizing the private sector, empowering the private sector, so looking to what types of opportunities there are, Power 7, things like this, increasingly within the private sector to take on this water stress challenge at home and globally. The second is, I would just emphasize, going back to, you know, there are two documents that have been released recently, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, you know, which lay out what the priorities are very clearly, particularly the National Defense Strategy. I mean, I would think about, are there ways to link the challenges created globally by water stress to those stated priorities? And how can we create narratives and convincing arguments that the two are related. I mean, this is not something we had time to take on as part of this particular MAB effort, but I would put forth that there are probably ways to do that, and I could see that potentially being effective as well.
Just a two-finger on that. On the national security strategy explicitly, concepts of resilience are laced throughout that, and actually quite literally, resilience is stated as a strategic goal for the United States. And so that provides an architecture under which to embed the water issue. And also in terms of the strategic competitions framing of the NSS and the NDS, there's clearly an alternative development model on the horizon, and it's called China. How does China think about human security and the water dimensions of that, and how does it differ from the development models that we've been used to? I mean, that's a really important security question that we're grappling with internally, but we would certainly welcome other perspectives around the world. And interestingly, the role of the private sector is really different in the Chinese model. And there are different values that are maximized in that Chinese model. And so one of the questions for us is human security one of those values?
Okay. Last question, two questions in the back.
Hi, Eagles Milbergs. I'm with a Puget Sound Accelerator in Water, co-founder of it. How do we move from problem to solution was one of the questions the panel had. How do we create a set of success stories? We're an accelerator trying to develop new water technology. What we've observed is across the 15,000 watersheds in the United States and thousands of more, I'm sure, across the globe, is there are many experiments going on, policy experiments, financing experiments, technological experiments, governance experiments, regulatory experiments. We have the capacity through collaboration platforms and IT to start capturing these experiences and to begin to share them, you know, across, if you will, stakeholders, and create kind of a learning system so we aren't just kind of gnashing our teeth over the problem, but actually starting to talk about a set of solutions, you know, that might make sense. So it seems to me there's nothing holding us back from creating this system of success stories on a global basis, and the United States ought to be leading it since we have such leadership and when it comes to IT and collaboration platforms. So I think we can move forward in the direction that I think a few of you folks are suggesting. Anyway, it's maybe more of a comment, but.
No, that's great, Eggles. And if I might say on behalf of Wilson, we're looking for a little nod from Lauren here, that we would welcome receiving those success stories because we have platforms where we can put that information out on New Security Beat and elsewhere so that we can begin to share this more broadly across the community. Yes.
Yes, Lee Angelelli from IBM. My question is, what advances are being made within big data and AI technologies to be able to come up with like a systems thinking platform that allows you to have continuous assessment to identify water security drivers, pressures, and impacts to regional economic, social stability and ecosystems, and then be able to improve, decide, and act on the best investments, programs, working with different groups to come up with solutions to those pressures, impacts, and then a continuous measure and evaluation. So did your programs meet the intended effect? And then apply that to lessons learned.
Okay, great question, Lee. Sounds like IBM's got the answer for that.
Watson.
Yeah. Okay. Any responses on that one?
I think I don't have a specific response to your question, though, but I think your question is pointing us in absolutely the direction in which we're headed, I believe. I think that's the spirit of the forecasting community, is trying to leverage, whether it's data mining or of the traditional form or artificial intelligence, as you're suggesting. One piece of that, though, where things are transforming so rapidly is the availability of data, in ways that we have really not lived with yet, which will soon, within the next 5-10 years, be transformative. And so I think the concept that you put on the table there is definitely within reach, but it's something that I don't think we know necessarily where it will take us. And I love the final observation about learning about the effectiveness of our programs and keeping us all honest. Because I think that's one thing that we see in the intelligence community from the analytic perspective is we're often sometimes asked by our policy masters to, well, how well is DoD or USAID doing in improving the lot of life in the world? And it's something that we're not charged with doing, but it is something where policy leaders are looking for rigorous, evidence-based answers to those questions. And whether they come from the private sector or civil society or government probably matters less, but yet that we have lots of those types of answers available.
If I could just add to that, I'm thrilled by what's going to happen with big data, but it's got to integrate the physical information about the physical systems with the social systems, because they're so tied together that everything you might say points to this answer until you put the people into it. You have a real challenge.
Right. Well, let me see. That's where I see the innovation coming in, and it's coming out. The tools and the technology obviously is coming out of the private sector today, and it will enable us, I think, eventually to move sort of beyond, where we are today with weather to this more reliable interim predictive capability that's going to enable us to do a lot of things if we want to at the nexus of where water stress meets instability. But of course, it also takes political will, and that's sort of where we also have a responsibility to prepare for the future, because we have both, the unprecedented risk that we see in this field, but also the opportunity of developing unprecedented foresight into the future. And so that's the exciting part. I want to also thank, as we close out here, I want to thank the other analysts on the CNA team, Doug Jackson and Kara Thuringer, for your work on this, along with the rest of the team at CNA that Sherry has led. And I want to thank our panelists and our audience for being part of this discussion today.